And joining me now as part of our continuing series talking to policymakers, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor, was Chief Economic Advisor till December, remember. Mr. Subramanian, Dr. Subramanian, appreciate your joining us. Inflation continuing to surge. It's now 15% wholesale price index. How bad could it get? What are the solutions? You've been intimately connected with the Indian economy over the last few years. In fact, you were Chief Economic Advisor till December. But when I look at wholesale price inflation spiking, rising prices across food and other commodities, is this purely a result of a global crisis? Or will you now concede there is something intrinsically wrong because it's 13 months in a row, Mr. Subramanian, we've had double-digit inflation in the country, including the period when you were Chief Economic Advisor last year?
So firstly, Rajdeep, thanks very much for inviting me. First, what we have to do is, we have to look at CPI inflation, not WPI inflation, because what the consumer really looks at and what the consumer feels is the CPI inflation, and monetary policy itself is actually based on CPI inflation as a benchmark. So, I would want to correct you to tell you basically that the statement that you made about inflation being, at a high double digits for more than a year, etc., is incorrect, because the viewers might think that is basically CPI inflation. CPI inflation had been very much in control as long as till December at least. It was.
Dr. Subramanian, with due regards, I will stop you to say I mentioned wholesale price inflation has spiked. But even, Dr. Subramanian, retail inflation has risen last month in April to a high of 7.79%. So let's not beat around the bush, sir, this time.
So let's understand that, right? In the United States, where inflation has typically been 2%, now they are having 8.5%, a 40-year high. UK has had basically a 30-year high. Germany has had a 26-year high in inflation. Turkey has had 70% inflation. Brazil is 12%. Argentina is 60%. So, you basically see the global environment, because of the money pumping that happened, especially in these advanced economies during the COVID, the Keynesian demand priming, you're seeing actually, unprecedented, compared to 2%, 8.5%. In contrast, we are basically, we were at 6%, less than 6% up until December. It's now because of the Ukraine crisis. And if you look at, and dig into which are the main areas. So, food inflation as part of CPI has contributed about 45%. Of that, edible oils, and they've been particularly impacted because of the war with Indonesia, putting a export ban on palm oil, sunflower oil, which is actually a big, Ukraine as a supplier, has been impacted. So these are basically what are creating inflation. So it's primarily global factors, and you have to keep that in mind. So, some of the sort of statements and the negative tinge statements that you're saying, I think need to be very, very carefully looked at by the viewers.
No, Dr. Subramanian, I concede there are supply side bottlenecks. Global inflation is a worry across the world at the moment. But it is clear in India also, in the last 4 months, inflation, and I refer here to now retail inflation, has remained above the RBI inflation target for a 4th straight month. These are genuine concerns, particularly now you've got wheat prices, question marks over government procurement. They are at an all-time high. The government now going in for an export ban. It almost seems that the government is now suddenly waking up to a few realities, was living in denial for the longest time. Would you at least agree with that we can't go with don't worry, be happy?
Rajdeep, I'll be blunt. I have done interviews with you over the last several years. Especially over the last 6-7 years, you tend to focus only on the negatives. Even when there are many positives, and the fact that the current inflation environment is primarily because of the global factors, and I've given you the data for that as well. Yet you are continuing to, to basically just mention the same point. I think you have to be, very, very careful in making sure that our viewers get the right, impression that inflation is primarily because of global factors. And if anything, and I mentioned this before as well, before this war, India was singularly, noteworthy in a positive manner in the way we actually had managed inflation, recognizing the supply side shock. Now, as for wheat, wheat, for instance, you know very well that Ukraine is a big exporter. I just mentioned Indonesia has basically, has banned exports of oil, and so oil has been a big contributor, in fact, almost 20%. So these are all global factors over which India has no control.
Sir, India has certainly control over wheat prices, where there are questions over procurement and production. But I want to ask you again, you are saying I am looking at the bad news. Perhaps I am, because that is my job. I look at the bad news, I look at the rupee falling, I look at consumption still not picking up, I look at these inflation numbers. You feel I am wrong only looking at the bad news. Please give me the good news. First, will you at least concede that the bad news also needs to be looked at, and I am happy to listen to the good news also from you about the economy.
Yeah, and let me then compare actually with a time when you actually used to look at the positives far more. During the global financial crisis, the rupee depreciated by 56%. We had inflation that was basically in the double digits for 18 months, and this was retail inflation. We had a fiscal deficit that was 2.5 times that of the rest of the peer economies. We had a current account deficit that was close to 6%. We were part of the fragile five. In contrast, what have we basically delivered here? We fiscal deficit of 90% of peer economies, current account surplus. Right. We have actually, if you look at the depreciation itself, it's been 0.06% compared to 60%. How many more good news do I need to give you for you to basically stop portraying all the time, in a negative manner, especially over the last 6-7 years?
No, you're now asking me to compare 2008 to or 2009 to 14 when Manmohan Singh was in power with now what's happened in the Modi Raj. But I still want to ask you, if I continue to call it a difficult, adverse economic situation, what do you then see as the way forward? We are in 2022, forget about the past. We can only sit, we can't only sit and blame the global economy surely. What would you like to see happening to change the story? What would you believe needs to be done to turn the corner, especially when we seem to be heading for a period of high inflation? Or are you telling me this is something we are going to have to live with because of the global factors remaining uncertain?
Okay, so let me again, I don't want to actually confess the words that you are putting into my mouth of basically blaming. I'm not blaming. I'm just giving the reality to our viewers, and especially to make sure that, narratives that are actually tinged in a certain color do not gain traction. That's been my intent. These are global factors over which India has absolutely no control, and that is something that you have to recognize. There are factors that you can control, and there are those that you can't control. Now, as for basically, if you look at the going forward, commodity prices have actually started easing in many cases, and that is, I think, good news. If you look at iron ore, for instance, it has declined from its peak by about 44%. You've had aluminium, steel, zinc, copper, lead. Many of these commodities actually, decline. Together with some of the lockdown-induced economic activity decline in China, and possibly, US going into a recession, which will have an impact definitely on demand. I think going forward, some of this will definitely ease. So the main contributor, which is global factors, will actually, will possibly start looking better. I don't think anybody can predict these in market prices, but these data do seem to suggest that global factors, which are the major contributor to inflation here, will basically start easing out to some extent.
Well, that's reassuring at one level, but let me again go back to what is the situation today. The falling rupee, India's foreign exchange reserves, Dr. Subramanian, have now fallen below $600 billion, 8 months after hitting the record high in September 2021. People are, FIs are withdrawing money. Should I not be worried as an observer? Or are you telling me all of this is a temporary blip? As I said, don't worry, be happy is the mantra, that things will get better in a few months from now. Is that the approach to take, you're saying?
No, I will again actually emphasize how you are picking up the data. Instead of emphasizing the fact that, our foreign exchange reserves reached a record level, you are basically saying, oh, they have declined compared to a record level. The fact that even now we're so comfortable on our foreign exchange reserves is something that you're not mentioning, which is basically part of the trend of what I've observed, and I something bluntly mentioned. I think, the fact is that the Indian economy, especially macroeconomy, has done really well. These are factors that have come from an exogenous shock, which is the war. I am not a war expert, but I think, if basically some of those external factors start easing out, we should start seeing better, going forward. But that is not a guarantee, of course.
Of course, you keep mentioning external factors being responsible for the state of our economy, and one would concede that at some level. But what can we do for what is within our control, you believe, to ease prices? Let's assume that the global situation is uncertain, the war in Ukraine continues for a while longer, oil prices remain high. What can India do at the moment, Dr. Subramanian, to ease the situation for the common man who is being burdened by rising prices?
So I think, firstly, as you've already seen, monetary policy, there has been some move, and I would, I think monetary policy has to walk the tightrope in ensuring that the, GDP growth is basically, not affected materially, balancing the inflation versus, GDP growth, recognizing that, most of these factors are exogenous, which we have no control over. That's something we have to, at the same time, while typically, if you look at food inflation, two main contributors have generally been pulses and oil. I think, pulses seems to have not been that big of a problem. Oil is, and I think that's something we have to work on, because as I have mentioned earlier as well when I was in office, that primarily these come from supply side aspects, and therefore we need to work on ensuring that some, especially oils, we are trying to sort of find substitutes. And I think it is not, see, if food demand remains basically what it is, it doesn't change very much. So it's primarily supply induced, and therefore we have to work on the supply side.
Right through this interview, I'm good to see you in such a combative mood, Dr. Subramanian. It's almost like watching your favorite Umran Malik or my favorite Umran Malik playing the IPL. It seems to have made you combative. What you are saying is easing the supply side, therefore, is the key. Am I correct? That the government's challenge is to ensure that supply chains are not blocked to the maximum extent. That would ease prices. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yeah, I would respond that, given that now I'm just an academic, I actually can take your bouncers and hit them for sixes. Earlier, I had to actually hit them for fours.
That's a very nice way of putting it. Both of you and I are cricket fiends. But what broadly do you see the present system? What can be done to improve the present system? I come back to it. There's a sense that, for example, when global oil prices were low between 2015 and 18, they remained high in India because of duties. Do you believe, therefore, this is a moment to ensure duty rationalization? Would you like to see that? Could that taper up prices a bit?
No, I actually, as I said, see, supply side is primarily, a medium term aspect. That is what we have to work on. I've emphasized this earlier as well. Indian economy, if you look at, we have to continue working on relaxing the supply side constraints. I think, given some of the demand side aspects, as I said, US, economy basically it will not heat up. If anything, will cool down. I think, Europe also, demand is likely to be lower, and China, given basically what it's going through. I think some of the demand side pressures that there have been, and the central banks there are cutting down on, basically they're actually raising and reducing money supply. So we should see overall demand coming down, I think. But from our side, I think we have to focus on, some of the fixes, especially to pulses and oil seeds in the medium term, but pulses and oil seeds together actually in the medium term.
You didn't answer petrol duties. Should they be rationalized? Aren't they much too high at the moment? Should there be rationalization to ensure the burden doesn't pass on to the common man of petrol price rise?
See, that I think is something which, we've spoken about, at length. I've mentioned earlier as well that if you look at the overall, taxes, there's a large part that comes from states, and I think, that is something states have to work on as well. State and center together have to coordinate on this aspect. And overall, if you look at the taxes on crude and compare it to other countries, whether it's a Britain, Germany, US, many of these countries, our taxes are not greater than those compared to, to other countries. And you do have to keep in mind that we still are basically continuing the subsidies that we were giving on some of the, the food, etc., 800 million people. And I think for none of that does money grow on trees.
Money doesn't grow on trees. I remember when Dr. Manmohan Singh said that, he was, of course, attacked by everyone. But thank you, Dr. Subramanian. You've been very candid, very combative. We've had the bad news on the economy, but let's turn to the good news at the end. You're a great cricket fan. So on a happier note, who's going to win the IPL?
I think Gujarat Titans actually might have a very good chance, but maybe Rajasthan Royals might be the surprise, especially given what they might feel to maybe dedicate it to Shane Warne.
Well, it's Khushbu Gujarat ki. When it comes, of course, to political power, Rajasthan is a Congress-ruled state. Forget about the politics at the moment. On the cricket pitch, it appears Gujarat and Rajasthan are battling it out in the IPL. Thank you very much, Dr. Subramanian, for joining me here on the news today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.